Welcome back to Active Duty. I'm your host, Julie Brauman. We are joined by Colonel Joe Rice, who's been deployed to Iraq 4 times. Right before, we just talked about the first one. Now let's talk about you were deployed the second time, October 2005 to February 2006. Third time, October 2007 to January 2008. How did your duties change in both of those deployments? And what kind of change did you see from the first time you were there?
Sure. Well, my first tour was mostly set establishing and then being an advisor and liaison with the Baghdad City Council. My second and third tours were, my job would essentially be to spend a few days with different units in different parts of Baghdad and just see how they were interacting with the people on the street, the Iraqi police, the Iraqi army, to kind of gather things that were working well, lessons learned, and as well as just kind of the general situation there. And then in short, I'd kind of write those things up and send them back to the United States, where units that were training to come to Iraq in the future would have up-to-date information and up-to-date things that they could use for training scenarios and such. So it was interesting to see the snapshot and to go back the first time in 2005 to see folks that I had last seen, a year and a half or so prior. And there was still hope and optimism, but the situation was tenser. I mean, violence had continued, it had increased some, and there was a real question about whether or not what was going to happen to Iraq, how were things going to work out. And then when I went back on the third time, I kind of missed the peak of violence. There was far too much violence, during all this period, but the good news is on that third time back, the surge was underway, and you could see in places, certain parts of the Baghdad that I went to, that were difficult or impossible to go into even the year before, you could go into now, and then to see how things were starting to build and develop there, and it was spreading. So the security situation was getting better, but it was being provided by U.S. troops as part of the surge. And that's, as we jump ahead to the fourth tour, security is still better, and now it's being provided by the Iraqis. So, but during that second and third tour, it was tense, and we were wondering, it reflected the national debate we were having here at home. What should we do in Iraq, and what's going to happen there?
Did you have a chance to go back and check on what you did in the first tour, is put together some of those councils and just kind of check on the progress of that, and what did you find?
I did, because, again, it was part of the duties to see how we were working with local council members and policemen. So I would go to and see many of the same people that I had worked with before. The good news is, some of them were still there, and also it's also good news that some of them had been replaced in elections or had decided not to run again. So it was great to see the system develop. There were still challenges at the council level, but again, they were building things, and they were both physical infrastructure and building the institutions of government, which is maybe hard to describe, but we often take it for granted, I think, here, and for people over there who had come out of a dictatorship and then had periods of great violence and chaos, these things are very important.
So by the fourth time, comparing to day one to the fourth, how can you kind of summarize the evolution of over the years?
Well, I think we would say that, in the third time, we were getting the security situation under control, and that was the plan of the surge. A surge of troops to calm the security situation. Well, we did two other things: build up the government and their ability to provide services, and build up the local security forces, the Iraqi army and the Iraqi police. And so that was underway during my third tour, and now when you jump ahead to the fourth tour, you can see that those efforts of the last few years have been working, because on June 30th of 2009, just a few months ago, Iraqi security forces took over 100% of the security responsibilities for the cities in Iraq, and U.S. troops are now more of an advisory role, and that will continue for a little bit of time. But right now we have 124,000 troops in Iraq today, and by August we're going to have 50,000. So you can see that the drawdown is progressing, and the only thing that's enabled that to progress is the built-up capacity of the Iraqi government to provide services and the security forces.
What about the reaction of Iraqi citizens to the military from when you first went over there until your fourth? I mean, was there much more of a trust?
I think so, and individually, I think Iraqis and soldiers always got along fabulously. When you actually get down to that level, it tends to work. You tend to get along very well. You get to know each other. The surge, the real key to the surge was not so much 30,000 additional troops, which is what it was, but it was a change in tactics. In 2004, 2005, 2006, the U.S. approach, the strategy, was to consolidate U.S. military troops on large bases, go out to do operations, and come back. Well, that isolates you from the population. And when the surge came, it was to get out into the neighborhoods, to live in the neighborhoods 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and that's where you build the relationships which enable you also to get a better handle on the security situation, which enable you to build the capacity of the government and build the capacity of the security forces.
We're going to talk about next, in the next segment on active duty, a very special relationship. Coming up next on active duty, we'll talk about that very special sponsorship program that affected Colonel Joe Rice personally. That's coming up next right here on Altitude. Stick with us. And welcome back to Active Duty. We're still joined by Colonel Joe Rice. Now, a couple segments ago, we told you about an Iraqi citizen named Rod Al-Kurdi. He was an interpreter. You met him on your first tour, would see him periodically. Saw each other again in 2007 when Rod told you that his twin brother was assassinated by Iraqis, and he was afraid. So at that point, did you agree to sponsor he and his family to eventually come to the United States? That must have been, tell me about that decision and that conversation and how that all came about.
Yeah, it actually happened on my third tour, is when he had told me that his brother had been killed. And again, that was during the height of the violence, and these are two guys, in this case, who stuck with the United States to try to do the right things through the most difficult times to try to help their country. But by working so closely with the United States, there are some people in Iraq who would never forgive that, even though the general security situation is better, but just by given the fact of their association. So there was a program for people who had worked a year for U.S. forces. They could apply for refugee status. You know, he'd worked for 5 or 6 years at this point, and a lot of the military units that he'd worked with and myself, we were like, you know, you've done your part. It's time now. He needed a sponsor. I agreed, and again, he's not somebody I really knew well. I just would see him occasionally, but I got to know him better as I would see him on subsequent tours, and I think he certainly has earned it.
What you did for him and what he did for our country is equally as amazing. But you changed his life. You changed his children's life. He must be very grateful for that.
Yeah, I think so, and we're grateful, as you mentioned, for his service and his family's service. I can't imagine too many of us would put ourselves out there like he did to try to do the right thing for his country. And he hopes to be able to go back to Iraq someday, but until things are completely settled, and he was very worried about his kids, and after worrying about his kids and his wife for so many years that they would be targeted, because they were, he wanted to come to the United States, so he's come here. They've settled in quite well. Littleton community has been fantastic in receiving them. He's got a job. His kids are in school. They've learned English. You know, Rod knew English, but his kids and his wife didn't, but they've learned it rapidly.
So let's talk about you for a little bit. What's next for you? Are you a fifth time over there, or where do you see yourself going from here?
You know, I don't know. Certainly could come up. I don't plan on getting out of the Army Reserve anytime soon. So another tour might be in the cards, whether it's Iraq, which I've developed a little bit of expertise in, and relationships. It's important to me. But the last couple of months of this last tour even were actually spent looking at the lessons learned in Iraq and what could apply in Afghanistan. And so who knows whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, or somewhere else. And
as we close the show, what would be a couple of those lessons learned that you would like to apply if you do go to Afghanistan?
Well, I think that we tried to build the Iraqi security forces a couple of times before the last few years and got something that worked. And the short version of what we did different this last time that could apply to Afghanistan as well is not just focusing on training policemen and soldiers, but you have to develop the security institutions. Everything from internal affairs, so you can root out bad guys so the system can develop, to communications, to logistics, to maintenance, to medical. I mean, all those things that make the whole institution that were not there. The first couple times we built the Iraqi security forces were there this next time, and I think those are some of the lessons now that our nation is looking at applying to Afghanistan.
It sounds like you'd be a good person to go.
Well, thanks for your recommendation, I think.
Well, okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It was really a pleasure
to
have you, and thank you so much for what you've done for our country. So that was Colonel Joe Rice, and again, thank you for joining us, and that is this edition of Active Duty. Thanks for joining us.